Hi there, welcome to the final and concluding episode of the history of the modern day device known as the telephone. My name is Dimitri, and on this final episode, we will be reeling out some facts, some dates, and some personalities, as well as how the telephone evolved from what it was to what it is today. 1844, Innocenzo Manzetti first roots the idea of a speaking telegraph, known today as the telephone. 1854, Antonio Meucci demonstrates an electric voice-operated device in New York. Exactly what kind of device he demonstrated is still unknown. 1861, Philip Rice constructs the first speech-transmitting telephone. And on the 28th of December, 1871, Antonio Meucci files a patent, caveat number 3353, a notice of intent to invent, but not a formal patent application at the U.S. Patent Office for a device he names a sound telegraph. On the 6th of October 1877, Scientific American publishes the invention from Bell, at that time still without a ringer. 12th of November 1877, the first commercial telephone company enters telephone business in Fredericksburg, close to Berlin, using the Siemens pipe as ringer, and telephone devices were built by Siemens. 14th of January 1878, Bell demonstrates the telephone to Queen Victoria and makes the first publicly witnessed long-distance calls in the UK. The Queen tries the device and finds it to be quite extraordinary. On the 26th of January 1878, the first permanent telephone connection in the UK is made between two businesses in Manchester. Early telephones were locally powered by dynamic transmitter. One of the jobs of outside plant personnel was to visit each telephone periodically to inspect the battery. During the 20th century, the common battery operation came to dominate and was powered by the torque battery from the telephone exchange over the same wires that carried the voice signals. Late in the century, wireless handsets brought a revival of local battery power. The earliest telephones had only one wire for transmitting and receiving of audio and used a ground return path. The earliest dynamic telephones also had only one opening for sound, and the user listened and spoke into the same hole. Sometimes the instruments were operated in pairs at each end, making conversation more convenient but also more expensive. Users who wanted the ability to speak to 3 or 4 different shops, suppliers, etc., would obtain and set up 3 or 4 pairs of telephones. Western Union were already using telegraph exchanges, quickly extended the principle to its telephones in New York City and San Francisco, and Bell was not slow in appreciating the potential. Signaling began in an appropriately primitive manner. The user alerted the other end, or the exchange operator, by whistling into the transmitter. Exchange operation soon resulted in telephones being equipped with a bell, first operated over a second wire and later with the same wire using a condenser. In 1877 and 1878, Edison invented and developed the carbon microphone, used in all telephones along with the bell receiver until the 1980s. After protracted patent litigation, a federal court ruled in 1892 that Edison and not Emil Berliner was the inventor of the carbon microphone. The carbon microphone was also used in radio broadcasting and public address work through the 1920s. In the 1890s, a new, smaller style of telephone was introduced, the candlestick telephone, and it was packaged in 3 parts. The transmitter stood on a stand known as a candlestick for its shape. When not in use, the receiver hung on the hook with a switch in it, known as the switch hook. Previous telephones required the user to operate a separate switch to connect either the voice or the bell. With the new kind, the user was less likely to leave the telephone off the hook. In phones connected to magneto exchanges, the bell, induction coil, battery, and magneto were in a separate bell box called a ringer box. Cradle designs were also used at this time, with a handle with the receiver and transmitter attached, separate from the cradle base that housed the magneto crank and other parts. They were larger than the candlestick and more popular. Disadvantages of single-wire operation, such as crosstalk and hum from nearby AC power wires, had already led to the use of twisted pairs and, for long-distance telephones, 4-wire circuits. As at 1893, the country leading the world in telephones per 100 persons, also known as teledensity, was Sweden, with 0.55 in the whole country, with 4 in Stockholm. In 1893, the US was considerably behind Sweden, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Norway in teledensity. The US became the world leadership in teledensity with the rise of many independent telephone companies after the Bell patents expired in 1893 and 1894. By 1904, over 3 million phones in the US were connected by manual switchboard exchanges. By 1914, the US was the world leader in telephone density and had more than twice the teledensity of Sweden, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Norway. On the 7th of January 1927, W.S. Gifford, president of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, called Evelyn P. Murray to test the first commercial telephone line across the Atlantic Ocean. The history of mobile phones can be traced back to two-way radios permanently installed in vehicles such as taxicabs, police cruisers, railroad trains, and the likes. Later versions, such as the so-called transportables or bag phones, were equipped with a cigarette lighter plug so that they could also be carried, and thus could be used as either mobile two-way radios or as portable phones by being patched into the telephone network. In December of 1947, Bell Labs engineers Douglas H. Ring and W. Ray Young proposed hexagonal cell transmissions for mobile telephones. Philip T. Porter, also of Bell Labs, proposed that the cell towers be at the corners of the hexagons rather than the centers and have directional antennas that will transmit/receive in 3 directions into 3 adjacent hexagon cells. The technology did not exist then, and the radio frequencies had not yet been allocated. Cellular technology was undeveloped until the 1960s when Richard H. Frankel and Joel L. Hengel of Bell Labs developed the electronics. On the 3rd of April 1973, Motorola manager Martin Cooper placed a cellular phone call in front of reporters to Dr. Joel S. Engel, head of research at AT&T's Bell's Lab. This began the era of the handheld cellular mobile phone. The rapid development and wide adoption of pulse code modulation (PCM) digital technology was enabled by metal oxide semiconductor MOS technology. The MOS field effect transistor, MOSFET, was invented by Mohammed M. Atala and Dawan Khan at Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1959. The MOS IC chip was proposed soon after, but MOS technology was initially overlooked by Bell because they did not find it practical for analog telephone applications before it was commercialized by Fairchild and RCA for digital electronics such as computers. MOS technology eventually became practical for telephone applications with the MOS Mixed Signal Integrated Circuit, which combines analog and digital signal processing on a single chip, developed by former Bell engineer David A. Hodges with Paul R. Gray at University of Berkeley in the early 1970s. In 1974, Hodges and Gray worked with R.E. Suarez to develop MOS switched capacitor SC circuit technology, which they used to develop the digital to analog converter DAC chip using MOSFETs and MOS capacitors for data conversion. This was followed by the analog to digital converter ADC chip developed by Gary and Jay McCreary in 1975. By the 1990s, telecommunication networks such as the Public Switched Telephone Network (PSTN) had been largely digitized with very large-scale integration. The bandwidth of digital telecommunication networks has been rapidly increasing at an exponential rate, largely driven by the rapid scaling and miniaturization of MOS technology. The British companies Pi TMC, Marconi Elliott, and GEC developed the digital push-button telephone based on MOS IC technology in 1970. It was variously called the MOS telephone, the push-button telephone chip, and the telephone on a chip. Between 1971 and 1973, Bell combined MOS technology with touch-tone technology to develop a push-button MOS touch-tone phone called the Touch-O-Matic telephone, which could store up to 32 phone numbers. Telecommunication of the 21st century has been dominated by the development of the smartphone. This is a combination of a handheld computer, a cellular phone, a digital camera, and internet access. One of its features is the touchscreen that facilitates the primary interaction for users for most tasks such as dialing telephone numbers. Some of its software features also include email communication as well as audio and video playback and capture. And with that, we come to the end of the concluding episode of the History of the Telephone. Please subscribe, like, and share. My name is Dimitri. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.